but
Okay,
okay.
gotcha.
Mhm.
Okay, done. So yeah, now I think like we'll start with the first topic, right? Like I think like your question, like we'll start with the first question itself, Drew. So I'll raise my hand. Like Zoe, you can also raise your hand, or like we'll just point to each other. There is also a popcorn method, right? So once I finish talking about the topic, I can actually ask somebody else to share their personal opinions. So it's easier, much easier if you raise your hands. If not, if I point to you, it's much difficult to uh, like have a continuous conversation, right? So, Zoe, you can start, I guess. Microservices. I think like let's start with from the basics, right? Like define it in your personal opinion. What is microservices? Monoliths. What's your personal experience in Timeplus or like before, and how is the experience? Like, have you guys migrated or anything of that sort? Zoe, you want to go? Hey, can you hear me? I don't know whether I'm audible, but it's going to be funny. This
Okay,
video.
sorry, do you mean me? Sorry.
Yes.
Okay.
That's
I
hilarious.
was assuming it was Drew, I mean the
Okay.
person who raised the topic.
Well,
Yeah, you can go.
I've heard
Okay.
some pretty interesting definitions of it, but yeah, go ahead. I guess if you have some ideas.
Yeah. So really quick, that is I'm not really so close to tech as I did before, but for example, take our company as example. Um, we we know quite very well regarding how microservice should be looks like, because for example, when in the previous organization, a single product might have over 100 engineers, and we have a multiple different Scrum team. Each team may manage a few microservices, and actually many of those on-call tickets actually is not really, I mean, can be related to customer, but in many other cases, it's actually caused by other services. So we roughly know what is the microservice way to do, but in our case, as a startup company, we intentionally try to avoid microservice too early, too soon. There's some debate whether what's the team size that is perfect for a team to embrace microservice. But for example, in our company, there are about just 1,000 engineers, that kind of scale. So we intentionally minimize the number of microservices. For example, we can easily build maybe 8, but for example, we try to control as like 3 or 4, so that there'll be more responsibility for single component, but that give us a little bit more kind of velocity regarding how we can move things faster without too many worry about the communication between each other, the dependency management. Yeah, even today, we started to support both cloud and on-prem. Even for the cloud will be multi-cloud. So we still be very conservative to using too many components. Even you might know that some interesting stories, some company even using Google Spreadsheet as database, which really inspire us. I mean, it not have to be a best practice, but to some degree, it tells the kind of a potential option for you to using some boring technology to just make things work. So my take is more like it is kind of fancy and modern to using microservices a lot, but you don't always have to go that direction. Yeah, choose whatever works better for your team and the cadence.
I can share my personal experience as well. Like I think to begin with, this is my disclaimer, right? Like when somebody says, "Hey, this is what you should use," or "This is what you shouldn't use," I take a conscious choice that like that is not always the case. Every tool, every technology can work. I've seen that personally as well. But you're now coming to the point. In my past organization, we have personally moved away from monolith. Like we manually, like we literally saw the pain points of monolith, and then we splitted those into microservices. Like it was more of a like a 4 years, like a tenure. So like I've seen the evolution of, much better over time. I'll give you an example, right? So initially we just started off with like it's similar to Uber, right? So it's easy to relate to. There are customer related services, there are driver related backend services. But quick thought is like, for sure, customers, they use a product much more frequently for orders, checking in, all of that, in contrast to like drivers, like they use it rarely, right? Like the number of people using the product in terms of different persona also changes, right? So when we had monolith, stuff like login, let's say, when we wanted to scale, we had 30-ish instances for that particular service. And then it doesn't matter whether it's customers who's creating the load for you or whether it's drivers who's creating the load, because of one API under that monolith requires a large scale, we had to beef up the whole infrastructure for that particular monolith. So in that sense, for scaling aspects, going into microservices was helpful. Like that is one. And the second thing where we found it to be super helpful was team independence. Over time, we were able to leverage different tech stacks. So for instance, a lot of old teams, they were in JRuby, but we were able to migrate to Golang because these services demanded much more higher scale. And microservices sort of enabled it to like you can have your own roadmap, you can have your own tech stack, you can have your own certain practices. So that was also a huge value add on that front. But I personally think that, again, I think like as Zov mentioned, like initially the smaller team, it doesn't make sense. But as the company grows, the microservices is super helpful. But after a certain point of time, you need to have a good set of practices. If not, like you can have a microservices cascading failure effects. If you don't have the right tools and architecture to interact with the microservices, have a visibility, have ownership, and all of that, it's going to become messy beyond the scale. So I think that's where like people keep talking about migrating it back, migrating it in. Google works in monolith, yes, because they have awesome tools. They have awesome CI/CD. They have awesome, like brilliant set of technologies to work in a microservices structure, but in monolith, right? But if not, I personally think like microservices is helpful. Like I've seen it helpful in large context. What about you, Drew? Yeah, you can add on, like feel free to shoot questions also, but yeah, you can go.
Yeah. Well, I feel like you both given some pretty good and pretty interesting sort of explanations of areas where microservices might be helpful or how they might benefit an organizational structure or even the software. But it's not necessarily clear from that what particularly a microservice is independently from, say, so we might say like a microservice is a type of service, right, under a service-oriented architecture umbrella, but it's not just a like a web service under SOA. So what specifically is a microservice? And I think that's a little bit ill-defined. I've seen some places say, a microservice is a service that could be rewritten in 2 weeks. If somebody onboarded and we didn't know the code that they wrote, then another person could write it in a different language in 2 weeks, and that's a microservice. Or another person might say, a microservice is a service that doesn't have more than 25 functions, or some arbitrary thing. Like, I don't know. I've never actually heard that one, but what particularly makes a microservice, I think, is an interesting question. I think that typically the idea is that you've got a couple of different starting points. Sometimes you see, a team has a monolith that maybe it started with something like a Ruby on Rails initial MVP, and then kind of a startup grew from there, like you see with, like, say, Kickstarter or Twitter or a lot of companies over the past, say, 10 or 15 years. They started out, they got funding, they grew, and then they had this big application. I think Shopify is one as well, where they had like a 6,500 line class that was like a shopping item, or like something like that, where it grows and grows and grows. And then you have this idea to, okay, let's take this monolith that we sort of didn't keep clean, right? We didn't go back and refactor, and a lot of different engineers have come and touched these things and written these things, and maybe somebody wrote wrote a method here, or function call over there, and somebody else just came and followed that pattern without thinking, is that the right way? And so now you've got some stuff that's a little bit difficult to understand, so let's break it down into smaller pieces. And I think that's one way where people come into microservices. Another might be something like we saw, I don't know if we saw, but like back in the early 2000s, 2001, somewhere around there, there's the Bezos manifesto at Amazon, where he wrote, every team now has to offer what they're doing as a service to another team, and every other team has to interface with that team as if they were an external company. So you only have that interface, and the teams have to be small enough that the two pizza rule is going to be enough to feed that team. So that kind of goes back to, I think, Jove's point of keeping the team small, the communication structure small, things like that. But I guess the questions that I have are, there's obviously trade-offs in tech with any technology, anywhere you go. Some of the questions are like, are some of the trade-offs worth it? What sort of trade-offs do you have? So one thing, the way that I would describe a microservice would be, for one, any service itself should be completely independent of anything else, in that it has its own independent data, access to data. It has its own boundaries, and those boundaries would be, specific to what it's doing. That would be different potentially from anywhere else within anything else, right? So maybe it's an authentication service, maybe it's it just gives you the temperature readings in a particular area, or something like that as a service. Now, why you would necessarily want to have that as something as an independent system where you have to call over the wire to communicate, that's a trade-off you're going to have to weigh and balance whether it's worth it or not. Because you could also say, we have a monolithic architecture would be one where you have function calls and module calls within the same code base. So that you have libraries and library access, you're not calling over the wire. Whereas with a microservice architecture, or any service-oriented architecture, you have multiple services and you have communication that's not direct. So I guess some of the benefits might be independent scaling if you need that. And you talked about login, so you could have some sort of login. Now, the question is, if you could, like, people might say, I have a monolithic architecture, but then I have some middleware for authentication, and that's scaling independently, right? Or I obviously have something like, Cloudflare or whatever to handle my API requests. Now, do I also have some way to scale my data? And another thing would also, I think, be that's quite important when it comes to like just generally service-oriented architecture or microservices versus monolith, is what sort of data do you have? Right? Because you could have, if you have a monolithic data store or data that's completely related to each other, or like one kind of lump of data, you might have multiple services on top of it, but they're all still tied to the same data. So I think that's another question that you can obviously run into various things. So I have worked on some teams where we've gone from, we have a monolithic service, let's build out microservices. And one team in particular, the problem that we were solving by doing so was attracting developers. And I think that's maybe not the best reason to move to microservices, but it's an interesting one, maybe.
Yeah, no, I think you touched on definitely a few interesting points, right? Like data, not just teams. Like I sort of have personally felt the pain of defining structure in teams, because the moment you define a team, your architecture resembles the team, not other way around. Like let's say a company who has a vertical on stacks. Let's say if you ever define a CI/CD team, you're stuck with CI/CD team forever. So it shouldn't start from team like that. That I would agree. But the data, the scaling point is not just necessarily on the API level, right? It can happen at multiple levels. That's a good point. And the data source is also is a huge thing, right? Hey, who owns this data? Like we had instances where like a bunch of microservices have to copy data, Like, would you copy the data? Would you depend on replicas? Like, would you have a microservices, but both depend on the same database, or would you completely, like, the ideal solution is to move away from the data source and then treat the service as an owner and then talk to it. There are a lot of things which actually triggers that as well, right? But I think, like, if you ask me personally, I would vouch for a microservices, not considering team and size of the company, anything at all, like just purely from a domain perspective. I would start that as a Microsoft good place, because I am leaving infrastructure, how you deploy, as outer variable, because you can still have all the microservices deployed in a single VM. You can have all those small code bases linked together and all of that. But I feel like the domain is a good starting point. I can actually share something though. Let me just see whether I can bring this up.
Can I just ask a question on that?
Sure.
So,
Sure.
because I think it does make sense, but why would you start with microservices as opposed to, say, maybe each team could be working on its own module or set of modules or libraries?
So if you're saying,
why would microservice be the boundary definition?
Okay, so I didn't even bring the team into picture, but the moment you bring in two different teams, and then if you say, hey, you can have a libraries, what about, like, let's say I have breaking changes, then what happens? Like, much simpler way, right? If you're having a monolith, and then if two teams are working on modules separately, when you deploy it, everyone is affected. When you're a small scale company, that is perfectly fine. But the moment you grow into a large scale organization where you, like, high availability is critical, then a deployment shouldn't affect you, right? Like, why would a random promotion service should affect your login? So those sort of points sort of brings up.
I mean, it wouldn't have to. It depends on how you architect it, right? Like you could definitely say, okay, here's whatever the function signature is, and now I have a different function that's v2 or v3, and maybe it has a different signature. So your call to v2 is still going to work the same way, but now you just have a new one. So then you have a particular amount of time before you deprecate. I mean, it's literally going to be the exact same strategy as if you had microservices anyway.
No, I sorry, go on.
A point here. So I would like to bring up a point. So if you want, for example, to add to Drew, so whenever you're trying to deploy a particular application, so for small changes in one particular corner, for per se V1 or V2, so we have to deploy the entire application. So if it's in microservices, the scalability, the availability, and the deployments will become discrete to that particular service, right? So that's a good point. Instead of spending a whole time on your deployment, if it's a huge monolith application, it'll take some time for that particular executable and stuff, however you are deploying it. So that time would be considered, right?
I guess for you, Drew, that's a question for you. Didn't you face personal issues when you did deployment? Like, apart from development time, like, what did you deal with it, like, when you were doing deployments?
Not particularly deployment issues. That is a pretty interesting thing. Like, I'm trying to think if, let's say we have a monolithic code base where maybe there's you have everything just set up in different modules, so you make a change to a module. I think, like, 25, 30 years ago, you might have issues where the compiler takes an hour to compile and you've only made one change, and so that's a big deal. But I don't feel that, I guess maybe it depends on the scale of your application as well. I feel like if you're working with something like Go, like, one of its things is it's just a very fast compiler, but I think that a lot of compilers have become a lot quicker anyway. So the deployment you're talking, in the case of something being slow because I made a change, the compile time is maybe it's a couple of seconds, and whether that actually affects your running application, you're still going to have your CI/CD, and it's still not going to switch over until it's ready. So I don't see that as being a particularly big like make or break. But I guess, I mean, it depends on what it is that you're working on, right? There might be some cases.
Yeah,
it's a,
because for example, the current application that I'm working on is a huge monolith application, and it takes around 1.5 GB for the installer itself, and it takes around 1 hour 15 minutes in the CI/CD pipeline when we put it in Jenkins. So for such a huge monolith application, the deployment time for that small changes also matters, right? So if the application was discrete and we made it into microservices, then that would have been a good option there.
Yeah, but so even going back there, because now you're saying that in order to break up the pieces that need to be deployed, now we also need to add communication latency. But what if you were able to break it up instead into modules that were deployed separately, like libraries, literally a library that's deployed separately, or an import that's deployed separately. So now would you be able to break it up such that rather than compiling the entire stack, you're just compiling and redeploying that one library?
Mm-hmm. You're right on that point. Okay, what can be the demerits to that?
Well, because then the latency for the function calls or the library calls is very quick, right? It's pretty much instantaneous, as opposed to sending traffic over the wire, which also has potentially security surface area expansion as well.
Actually, I have some things here. So if we deploy kind of all those microservices into one kind of subnet and stuff, so then also the calls and the latency will be very less, right? So can that be considered as an option to this instead of modules? I'm not very familiar with this networking part here, but why can't we do some things like that?
Sorry, I missed the first part of it. What was the...
So as you said that, yeah, of course, I agree with your point being if we can deploy different modules as different libraries, and then the callings would be very easy and we can deploy it separately, right? So can we consider an alternative in the microservices world wherein we deploy different microservices in kind of same I'm forgetting the term here, but kind of the same subnet such that the latency would be very less when we are comparing it against latency.
So I can actually share a different point, like two things, right? Like I'll try to abstract it. First thing, again, I think as I initially mentioned, you can't argue over whether one thing works or one thing doesn't work, because Google absolutely, they managed to make monoliths work, but they had to build up a whole ecosystem of tools around it to make it work. Same way, you can make the monoliths work, but you just need to make a lot of things work together in a certain way. For example, she mentioned build time. Lot of factors goes in, right? So you can actually have a table of list of things. That way it's easy to compare. But now coming to your specific point you were discussing, you're talking about code which is talking to each other. But what about instances where I have 30 machines where you have a monolith, or you have 40 machines where you have a monolith deployment? Imagine if you're running a Java world, it doesn't matter how good your ecosystem is, a restart would take a minute. Would you want 40 minutes to wait? So then in order to handle that kind of deployment, I'm talking about runtime deployments, right? You had a V1, now you want to release V2 to users. You deploy those into VMs or in Kubernetes. It takes so much time. But if you're in Kubernetes, I have an option to say that, hey, you know what? We are using Golang. We're not going to take so much of your time. We are done because of you. Our deployment time is just 10 seconds. You know what? We'll just replace the API. We'll deprecate your API. Even the technology independence is there as well, right? So there is a lot of benefits in that sense. But yeah, I think if we argue, we can keep discussing other sides of it. But I think let's subtract it and then discuss on like personal experience or what you personally found microservices to be good, or any personal things which made you forced to move from microservice to monolith or other way around. Just quick recap, like Michael, Priyanka, Rajesh, like welcome again. The structure is lean coffee format. I don't know, like if you've had chance to read through. If you have any questions, you can drop it in Trello or feel free to share in the chat as well. It's a small group, so you can raise your hand and then speak up. At any point of time, if you have anything to add, just feel free to raise your hand and you can go on. If not, like we're just throwing questions and then sharing our personal experience and things around topic. I'm also taking notes, so we'll also share it at the end, and yeah, we can discuss on it. Cool. So still, like, is there any other open questions on those discussion from others? Like, I think like we've been discussing it for a while. Like, is there any questions around this one, like particular topic? Anyone?
I have a question. So I favor services or microservices because you can scale each one independently. You might have different roles, and some part might be processing, some might be just an orchestrator. How could that work in a monolith? How can you scale differently different components?
Processes, multiple processes.
You can add more detail. You can share more.
Background workers, multiple processes, multiple threads, concurrency. A lot of those things don't require you to have separate services to run them.
Okay.
I guess again it really depends, because I honestly, I mean, I've read a lot of literature. I mean, I even literally have like building microservices. I've been doing microservices for 12 years. I don't know what a microservice is. I don't know what people mean when they say microservices. And so I really don't know what the benefits are of them either, because I don't understand what they are.
Eventually you reach a state where like you realize, hey, this is nothing. Like I think it's all a theoretical thing, right? But I do believe in one thing, right? Like I think this is going back to theory. It sort of reminds me of something, cap theorem, right? Let's say when you want consistency, I feel like a monolith, or let's say even Zo can add up. Like when you have a database, we never thought about, like we never discussed around failures. Let's say something failed. And if you had process or like whatever it is, of course, it depends on infrastructure, but in terms of single point of failure, the only solution for us to scale is with like a different set of partitions or over network. And the moment you bring in network, there is going to be lags and communication issues and all of that. So it's more of a trade-off, right? Hey, I choose monolith because of this XYZ reason. Hey, I choose it because it's a single code base. I don't have to worry about network latencies. I don't have to worry about multiple versions. I don't have to worry about cascading effects and all of that. Versus if you're choosing microservices, you can say, hey, I have independence in team, independence in languages. There's so many things, right? But I feel like it's more about trade-off, like consistency over availability. It's the same thing, right? So in that sense, like it'll be interesting to sort of list out the value adds, but more than that, like I'm sort of curious on Drew or like others, like was there any issues with respect to like whatever architecture you're using, like personally, like let's say downtimes or like let's talk about issues, like not in a complaining sense, but like hey, personally, I saw this issue in microservices or like in monolithic ecosystem.
I can add a very quick comment that, for example, I mean, our company is doing database, right? So I guess you don't really hear a lot of story people using they build a database in the microservice way, right? Even for those super modern system, even like Snowflake, yeah, to some degree there might be multiple services, but if you're only talking about like Postgres or some other either stuff like DuckDB, stuff like that, it's kind of like monolithic applications, but we can also support clustering. Because the reason that is, if you're really aiming for high performance, then you might even want to like share memory, share some buffer. You want to minimize the communication, right? So I guess it's not really so common to leverage microservice in the database itself. But for example, in our case, we still have extra UI layer, we have extra application layer, and some other kind of source and sink. Such services can be built as a microservices so that we can have a relatively isolated responsibility. We can upgrade the version without impacting others, stuff like that. But yeah, it's always a trade-off for sure. But at least for the domain of the database, we don't really consider microservice is the kind of the preferred way, but just for the kernel itself. But for the surrounding ecosystem and the components, surely, if you're looking for stuff like you can upgrade independently, you can have a different tool set. For example, this component is written in Java, that component is written in Go or Rust. Microservices really give you the good kind of framework to introducing the kind of independency and kind of also, yeah, I mean, as Ganesh mentioned that sometimes when you design a team, that team actually just reflect the architecture, or when you ship a product, actually you are shipping your org chart. So it's more than just technical discussions. So again, this is not really a very interesting answer, but I just want to share my perspective. That is, in some cases, microservice is not really a good option. Yeah, if you really care about performance and you have other ways to get things done. Yeah.
Yeah, and one quick thing I would like to add here for microservices, that when I was working with microservices, we had around 5-6 services which were very critically dependent on each other. So one update on one particular microservice is crucial for the second one, and then it's a sequential one. So to revert these changes, so if one call fails, we have to revert the calls previous to that. So that is very critical in microservices.
Do you mean the services version? Like if you have updated V2 and like everyone have to go back to V1?
No, I mean the updates on the particular services database. So for example, if 5 services are dependent on each other and in one service, the call fails, we have to revert the changes on the database for the rest of the microservices as well, if they're critically dependent on each other.
I think that brings up a question as to whether, if you have services that are critically dependent on each other, if you have microservices or if you have a distributed monolith. And I think or maybe is that just semantics? But it does seem to me like a lot of the time when people talk about microservices, they're talking about just taking a monolithic application that could be a monolith and saying, oh, this is a bit of a mess because we've got a lot of dependency. So we want to just break out that dependency over multiple services that are still dependent on each other. And then you just have a distributed monolith. What is the, coming back to it again, to me, at least, if I were to build out a service oriented architecture, I would have independent services that are services independent of each other, whether they're teeny tiny services, medium-sized services, microservices, or whatever. To have them be independent, I think would be a pretty big tenet of that, and to be able to, or maybe, but it depends. Maybe my overall system needs to be resilient, or maybe we need to look at what are the problems that we need to solve. But I guess that's a big question. So you have these services that are critically dependent on each other. What are the trade-offs, I think, of having them be separate? What are the benefits of having them as separate services? Why not combine them into a single service?
Very good perspective there. So for our case, we went to microservices for the scalability perspective. All of them were having different domains and stuff. One of them were when we had a lot of requests coming in for a particular service, it was easy for us to scale when it was on different service altogether. So some services were interacted at least amount But your perspective here is very good, wherein we can still make a distributed monolith application with different services and different scaling perspective. Yeah, I mean that needs some more research. Yes, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Like maybe oh, go ahead.
No, I think like if you want to keep discussing microservices and monolith, I think for the whole session, I'm fine with it. If there are other topics, I think we should move on to that. Like ideally, like there should be a time bound. Okay, so Michael, I have a question. Could you elaborate on what means for services to be independent of each other?
Independent of each other. Yeah, that's a good question as well, because I mean, if you have a service that nothing depends on, then how big of a service is it really, right? But yeah, it's a good question. So I was thinking, you know, in the case that I mentioned, like maybe I have a service that just gives the weather, you know, you get the temperature. So maybe you give me a the name of a city or a location or a geolocation, and it returns the temperature of that. And so any, you know, that could be a service. Now, what would that be dependent on, and what would be dependent on that? That's actually an interesting question. So would I say if I'm making now a system, or maybe I just make a website that shows the temperature when you plug it in and it uses that as a service, is that a microservice? Do I have a microservice architecture? Probably not, right? I'm just accessing it as an API, and that would be a service. Now, behind the scenes, what services would it have behind it to plug in to actually give it the temperatures? So maybe it has obviously some sort of consolidation of ways to actually get temperatures in various locations, and then you might need to drop the okay. But yeah, I think so. First of all, services that would be independent from each other, I think one thing would be if the service went down, the other services would still continue to go, right? So you could remove a system from, or you could remove a service from the system, and the system doesn't fail. So not a single point of failure. I think that would be one big thing for a service to be independent of each other.
Cool. So I would just suggest one thing, right? Like I think like more than theoretical sense, let's keep the discussion to technical, and then let's also keep it to your personal experiences. Of course, like if we share general opinions, like we can keep debating, right? So I just had one thing to share. Like I think like I feel like it's slightly relevant, so because I shall share it. Like let's say, I mean, this is the same case I was talking about. Yeah, of course, like we'll be able to scale monolith even beyond that. But two other cases which I found interesting was, one is we were able to leverage event-driven systems in a proper way, where like I know you can bring in event-driven systems and then like bring into monolith, but microservices just has like the structure is very like supportive of this extensibility, right? And one other cases where like we had better use cases were like this particular service, like let's say we had to upgrade to Cassandra, like because in some cases you cannot scale your data. Like of course you can have partitions of data, you can have sharding and all of that. But in some sense, even to do archival, like I'll bring up one point, right? So if you have a monolith, if you have all the tables related, it's in a single place. Imagine the vacuum or like a deletion taking place. That's going to put so much trouble on your whole system. So if you had a separate microservices, separate team, separate like separate module, whatever, I think it's more about the concept, right? Like as you said, you can define the module in a microservices way, but like let's call it independent in a way that, hey, this is not affecting the other set of services and then other set of APIs, then it's fine. Like how you like achieve it is a different thing. But that database, I can have a different archival policies. I can scale it in a different way. Those things also adds up. But yeah, just one case, like same thing I was talking about, right? Like the whole reason we pulled it out as a microservices because we wanted to scale this in a massive way in contrast to like this particular other code base, like module, which was on low scale. So it enabled us in that way. But yeah, like having said that, I think like it'll be interesting sort of list on things. Like I think we should share a list of articles, how people are using microservices and all of that.
That seems to me like what you're looking at is showing how events coming into the system can update multiple different parts and different areas, which I think that's a pretty good point. I think is how something might be independent as well. So you have events coming in, and you had the pub sub there as well, right? So whatever actually is interested and cares about those events can be listening and update independently, and it's really about those events. And as long as those events are coming in and being published somewhere, then that's great. So that's actually another question: is like, is an event source system, is that synonymous with microservices?
No, I think you're too much into microservices definition. So let's talk about event sourcing as a separate thing.
I think you're right. Yeah. I'm
Yeah,
too caught up on the definition.
It's more about, I think, like eventually what we are getting to is we are agreeing into the base things like, hey, these two systems should be independent, these two should be able to scale, this deployment shouldn't affect this. These attributes, I think, like that is what we are agreeing on. Hey, whether you're pulling it as a separate code base or whether you're keeping a module and then having a tooling around it to deploy it separately, it's all up to them, right? But yeah, like I think if people haven't read it, I think Microservices by Altman, Sam Newman, is it? That's a good book. Maybe if you have a book suggestion also, please do share it. If anyone else have a question, please do shoot in a different topic as well. If not, I'm gonna like suggest a different topic. Let's say like does anyone have a very different topic to sort of ask? We can discuss around it. Anyone has a question topic? If no topics, I can ask about your downtime experience. Like that will definitely bring up a lot of interesting topics. If not Kubernetes, or let's say like any technology transition, stuff like that, or tooling. If you don't have a preference, yeah, like we can go with, let's say, downtime experience. Let's say
downtime experience.
Yeah. So I mean, I'll share more context, right? Like, so anytime, feel free to propose a question, share context around it. Others can pitch in and then like jump in and then add the context. So in my case, I've literally seen downtimes ranging from code issues, deployment issues, but over a time, it's not because of the code bases, but we have faced a lot of downtimes because of network issues, because of the way it's architectured. It's because of the high scale. Like sometimes it's not under your control. Like we even faced issues where subtle changes in Google underlying infra restarts, not the VMs. Like they restart something in their racks. We were able to see that downtimes and all of that. But having said all of this, as you had more and more better architecture, which is what you grow with, it also becomes more and more tricky to find the issues. Of course, like observe, like all of how to figure out as a separate topic, but I personally found those war room experiences and that technical learnings to be super helpful. Then, like I think I stopped talking about like a language issue or code issue long back, but there were so many issues which popped up in my career over time. So that's why like that question is always my favorite. Yeah, even GitHub Actions, like we were talking, me and Joe were talking just before the call, like because of Actions, like a lot of people were affected and whatnot. So what was your downtime experience? Let's say, how did you fix it? Do you write RC? Like if you wrote RCAs, like what was the learnings, like technically in that sense? That's my proposal. Yeah. Anyone can raise hands and you can take it. If not, I'm gonna pick a name. I think you're on mute, Drew, if you're talking.
I'm not talking. I actually I can't think of any downtime experience that I've had recently. I've been
You didn't have a downtime? Really?
recently, yeah. Well, I haven't really been like in a situation where I'm on call or like working on something that's right now in production, as much as more on like the consulting side for the past little while.
Consulting side is chill.
I haven't had to face that for a few years now, which is a big thing, which is kind of nice, to be honest. I don't miss having the sort of 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. wake up because something is down.
What about you, Zoe, Timeplus? Did you want to? I think I'll delete this clip. Like you can say whatever you want to say. I'll delete this
Okay,
part.
yeah, I mean that something, yeah, it always happen, right? So I mean, for example, there can be some issue for the even earlier this discussion we are talking about GitHub having some issue for the actions, right? And even today I tried to update some of the versions and I failed to do so because my action was always queued. So I try to apply a hotfix or kind of stuff, but I cannot do so because GitHub has issue. So I mean, my point that is sometimes, I mean, we always try to have a runbook and the ICA, those are postmodern stuff, but still in the middle of the incident, sometimes there's a few stuff you don't really have the control. For example, I remember once a time we tried to upgrade a version which will be very straightforward, but that kind of upgrade actually led to much bigger node consolidation. Like we're using stuff like EKS and Carpenter, and you may know the way how they work. That is that when you upgrade a version from 1 to 2, they try to set up a new pod with that version 2, making sure 2 is healthy, then 1 is removed. But in the middle, you have more number of pod. If you are not lucky enough, you might reach the capacity, and they will be thinking of new node, and I mean, and also at end of the process, they will remove them nodes. So I mean, we expect that kind of downtime will be just like 5 seconds, but in the end, it will be 5 minutes. And during that 5 minutes, we don't really have much action we can take. Just have to wait. So again, this is really just one of the story that is. We should always aiming for good process and improving ourselves. But again, I feel like in this modern world, we actually don't really have 100% control. Sometimes you have to wait, or wish all the services up running.
I'm sort of like just reminds me. Like I think downtime doesn't necessarily have to be downtime for users, but like let's say production issues, like data issues are much more harder to figure out. Like it takes time to even realize there is an issue. Like let's say you lost bulk of records in your database. Like do you have any systems to sort of figure out those things? Have you had any issues of that thing? Just curious.
Yeah, yeah, I guess the general principle is should be plan for the worst, right? So we do have some kind of backup policies, right? Then in that topic, you might also bring up stuff like the time to recover and how many data will be lost. So we try to find a balance between like continuous backup vs kind of like at a certain interval, and the whole purpose of the cluster in the database world is try to do kind of a multiple replication for the same piece of data. So anytime if there are servers down, there's nothing lost, but there's always come to a cost, right? You might have always a higher infra cost. Yeah, so I guess we should minimize the downtime, and also we should minimize or try to avoid completely for the data loss, but there's always a cost behind it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll share a bit more context, right? Like the reason I asked it is not necessarily your database downtime. Like, of course, you can have replicas and backups and do restoration and all of that. But what I meant is, like, we had Kafka's, right? Like even storage, and then we used to store things. One incident, like people, like it was used for a payment system, and they reported a bunch of records as lost. I think in your case, probably it's easier to figure out, but like in an event-driven system, we keep it for some time and then like we can't track it. And then like it's really hard to prove that this data was not available, or like their services missed it, or like it lost somewhere down the line and stuff like that. So the data issue is much more complicated is what I feel. So that's what I meant, like not literally your whole database downtime. Yeah, sorry,
Well,
go on. Sure.
Were you using Kafka? So that, I guess for event streaming, but in an event sourced system, what you can do is you can have an immutable ledger of events, basically, whereby, sure, if you have your events will update your read models potentially, which could be potentially anything. And, you could have snapshots and, cold storage and so on, but you should be able to theoretically go back into any point in time where you agree upon what's happened and then just replay the events to get back to the state where you're at now. Theoretically, right? So that's the sort of the dream. And with something like an event store acting separately. But I wonder, and in Timeplus's case, and I'm not quite sure or that familiar with your solutions, but if it's something like a relational database like Postgres, SQL, or whatever else, they typically have other tables that will store the transactional records of changes to the tables for an amount of time. So you could still go back and look through that, although that wouldn't obviously be ideal for, trying to figure out what happened.
Yeah. For the database side, stuff like bin log or what's that called, write ahead log. So they always write log first before they flush the disk, stuff like that. So yeah, there's some mechanism, and yeah, we also apply such kind of technology or mechanism. But again, in the world of kind of a streaming processing, it's kind of interesting because there's some idea about exactly once or at the most once, but it's more like eventually consistency, but you don't really guarantee you will get the consistent view in that 1 or 2 seconds. So, and also when data is flowing, it's tricky to figure out whether you're missing 1 or 2, or you have to wait forever. Yeah, so that just brings extra capacity to the world. Yeah.
And I suppose if you make mistakes, right? So if you have maybe you have your policy such that it would be either eventually consistent or write once, but if I've seen some cases where so what you should be doing is have you have your event stream and then you have that hydrating your read models, but if you need to check if an event's there, then you'd be looking in the event stream at the last event and then going from there. But I've seen some systems where people have actually used the read model, which, as you said, would be eventually consistent. So before it's actually consistent as the latest, and then updating from that. So that could get your system into a state that you would have some errors.
Yep.
One thing I'll point out, right? Like I think you mentioned like exactly ones and all, like, but I believe like unless you're like a database, that's a different thing. But in an event sourcing or distributed systems, I don't think like exactly once is possible. Like this is something I can say with a like higher probability, because there are so many retries, and then like we're not just talking about like a one component like where you're writing. There are so many microservices. There's so much hops. And going back to the earlier point I was talking, like the Kafka, yes, you can store it theoretically, but we had such a load that like we came down from 6 months to 3 months, 3 months down to like 7 days eventually for particular topics. And in those cases, it's much harder to prove or disprove whether you had data in the system, or like would you prove, is it lost in the producer? Like if it's lost in the producer side, like you have no clue, right? But unless you have a system in place, it's just hard to track it. Like even tracing becomes super expensive and all of that, right? So like my only point is exactly once is not possible. Like eventually consistent is always the key. Even ordering is messed up always. When you have retries, when you have failures, the ordering is also messed up. But I think like the whole ecosystem should sort of consider it. Like if somebody comes and says that, you know what, like we only want order events in order, or we think that it should always be ordered and stuff like that. Like that creates a mess. But like every system have to be idempotent and all of that, right? Like those additional things sort of patched on in not just event-driven systems, but like in general microservices, all other highly available systems, right? Yeah.
Yeah, there are some tools in place that can help with a lot of it, I think. And I think that you need to decide, right, what you actually care about. So if you like only once, I think is definitely possible, just like 99.999% uptime or 99.9999% uptime is possible. It depends on how you want to build your system and what you want to focus on, and making, as with like everything in tech, making those trade-offs. So understanding them is pretty helpful as well.
Yeah, yeah. So I think actually Akanshka is from Amazon. Like maybe you should also pitch in. Like you've been quiet for a while. Yeah, you can jump and share how messy or like how awesome the systems at your places.
I'm actually not at Amazon. I'm at Microsoft, but it was just a funny video I saw a few days ago, and I just because everyone was discussing microservices, I wanted to share. And like right now, our stance in my team and in my organization, the stance is that we are blowing up the number of microservices we are using right now, and we need to scale down. So we are merging few of them. We are like deprecating few of them. So like right now I think Drew was talking about like it's better to have independent services. Like for example, in the last month what we were working on, like for getting some data for a single user, we needed to like talk to 6 different microservices. So that was a pretty messed up. Like it's forcing, because like this as I mentioned, it's like for a single user, if you need to talk to 6 different microservices to get some trivial data, it really like for a whole organization, you need to have like lots of things. You need to know a lot of things, need to store a lot of things about the users, communities, groups, etc. So it's like in our organization, it was like 150 microservices, which was not at all maintainable.
100 is still less, I think.
Without knowing the specifics about it, it does sound like, you know, if I want to query a system and then I have to hit, you know, all of these different services to consolidate it, that seems pretty difficult. But when, like what Dinesh was talking about event sourcing, you know, if you have a stream of all of the events that come in, and they could be maybe eventually consistently updating some sort of read database, you know, and that could be a relational data store somewhere that just updates based on the reads that you want to have for these users. So then maybe there would be 6 services, maybe 600 services, who knows? But it's all of these events that are coming in streaming, and they're just hitting that. So at any point in time, you could just look and do a single read, and you could have like that part of the system is optimized for whatever your, you know, just getting a glimpse into the user would be. But it's hard to say without knowing this.
Yeah, it's heavily dependent on the context. Like the system we have right now is like every service has their own database. So basically and the databases, like those different databases might have the same information, which needs to be eventually consistent. So it's a very difficult to maintain system.
The solution is to build more microservices. You don't need to call 6 microservices. Write a microservice, call all those 6, and then like return that. It's called BFF. Like I'm not joking, but like people used to adopt that like way before. But like Drew mentioned, we also transitioned over time to different microservices, looking into database replicas. But then eventually, like once you have a good events-driven system, you don't depend on so much data on other system. Like if you keep polling for like a particular record, like particular fields, then probably it's not. I mean, it brings back to his question, right? Is it well defined? That creates chaos more than problem. Like if it's not clearly defined boundaries or domain model and all of that, then it's a problem. But again, of course, like we are losing so much context. Like it's context specific.
Even for event-driven systems, would it be like more context dependent, like what the use case is? Like in my use case, like what my product and work looks like, it I'm not sure if it would be the best choice, for example, because it's pretty read heavy. So if if your system or if your DB is read heavy and like the writes are maybe let's say we call the rule of 5:20, that rule, like 5% writes and 20 sorry, I used the wrong number. I think it's something like 5% reads and 95% writes or something like that. So in that case, because there might be inconsistencies in if some events are asynchronous, some are in the wrong order. What do you think about that?
So I think two things to clarify, right? Like I think it's much like I'll bring this back again. Maybe I don't know where I have it, but two things, right? Like one is the inconsistency happens because of how you handle data. Like you have to have idempotent service, even if it's a microservice. Like your call can fail and then you can retry at later point. Like if you have async jobs, even without event-driven system, the inconsistency can happen, right? And to your point on like read heavy or write heavy, I think it's perfectly fine. Like those are all something how you have to handle. Like this is something like I was sharing like a while back. If you had read heavy system and write heavy system, you split master slave architecture, and then you have an API separately dedicated for read database, and then you can build a separate APIs for talking to write database, and then that way like it's segregated. So again, it all depends on the architecture you're playing with, right? So I don't necessarily think the event sourcing can bring lag because of which you are inconsistent, but I feel like let's say I'll put a different context, right? Like I was sharing it in other place. If you have a customer service and then if you have a trimmer service, the actual source of truth, like the data you want, it goes through your API. And then let's say whatever you call other microservices for, which is usually decorating data, or like when you try to give data to a back, like a mobile or a website, that's when you decorate things. Or you're like, I don't know whether you have too small split, but that time, if you have an event-driven system, you can also get data in that way, and then you can keep filling it up. So it is not necessarily like filling the whole data, but only some requirements. But again, like it has to be eventually consistent, as we were saying earlier, and consider timestamp. Like timestamp is super critical. Always assume it'll be out of order, it'll be redundant. Then your every code have to handle it. Like that's one downside. Like every consumer of that event stream should handle these cases. But yeah, like again, like if you share more context, I think it'll be easier to discuss. But if not, I don't think like it's going to cause trouble. Like it helps usually.
Well, it sounds to me like you'd want to have, or like you have multiple different services that have their own data stores, and that you're accessing that data, and so it's actually denormalized data, but at some point it has to become consistent somewhere, and then you also talked about like sort of your writes and your reads, and I wasn't quite sure which one was the majority, but I don't think it really matters too much. Like one of the things would be, if you have so event source systems, talking about that, but adding something to it, CQRS, which I think we kind of talked about a little bit, which would be separating your basically separating your writes from your reads and just having those somewhat separate. So your writes, your commands, they come in and they trigger events. Now that would be sort of the events coming into a system, triggering the events, triggering any change. That's any change to state that you could have stored as a immutable ledger of change. And that could be your source of truth. And that would update everything. That could be eventually consistent. The problems could definitely arise if you look at all of these multiple services that are updating their potentially denormalized data based on that event stream. But if they're updating based on each other, then that would be out of sync, right? Where you want it to be eventually consistent with the source of truth, which would be your event store. Exactly. Yeah, Martin Fowler, CQRS. And I think that would be like that would in effect, you could have multiple data stores, but one like an actual event store, so like eventstore.db, or you build your own, or write it to where you're really optimizing for that event storage, and then that would feed to like an event stream where maybe it's publishing the events, and any other read model would update based on that. And by read model, I mean maybe another service that has its own potentially like a Postgres database, or maybe has a MongoDB or whatever, probably in a lot of cases, like you'd want a relational database, because now you're going to be having some sort of relational data that gets updated, and then you have some projections based on that. But keeping those separate might be a way to go. But as you know, everybody said, it completely depends on use case and context. So
we can take another question, or like we can take like probably a lighter one. Like, does anyone have any proposal for a topic? We are loosely structured this time. I think, like, ideally, as in when we do it often, like if everyone has context around the topics, it'll be much easier to propose and share. Does anyone has any questions? Like any topic to sort of ask the whole community?
Yeah, I have a quick, I mean, I really enjoyed the conversation, but as I mentioned to Ganesh, that is, I have a hard stop at 7. I need to prepare that meeting. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to the recording and meet you guys in other meetup or even in person. Looking forward to it. Very, very great discussion today. Thank you, everyone.
thanks, Joe.
Nice to have you, Zoe.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.
Let me change to your.
Sure. Yeah, you can make me as a host. Yeah. Thank you. So I think like one question I'll drop, and then like probably we can drop off our like network, like we can stop the official recording. Like also, one question I have is like what is a tool like you personally started using recently? Maybe increase productivity, or like maybe you use it for your stack, or like anything. Like I'll give you an example, right? Like I found Mozilla SOPs a while back, and then after that, like I don't store any plain secrets in my system, and then you can check in stuff and stuff like that. Like that was pretty cool. So, or it could be even productivity tool. Like so, it's much easier to relate to, right? So we can share. Everyone should share this. I think like everyone would have one or other interesting tool, and then we can sort of end this. So yeah, do you want to go, Drew?
I don't know if it's so much of just like a tool or a productivity tool, but I think eventstore.com is something that I found to be really helpful when building out event-driven systems. That's
as in, is it like a cloud solution you use, or is it like
they do have their own sort of hosted solution, but it's basically a database. It's open source, and you can download it and run it yourself on your own desktop or on-prem or in cloud hosted, wherever. It's just a data store, but it works very well with if you want to solve a lot of the problems of event streaming and having eventual consistency versus write once, those sorts of policies. It's something that you mentioned Kafka, and I think Kafka is a great streaming service, great for streaming data, but it's not particular. I don't know. I haven't actually looked at it in a couple of years, so it might have changed. But it wasn't at the time particularly great for data storage. Whereas this really focuses on that.
Cool. Michael?
So for a few months now, I've been this is just a small process I've introduced. So I'm keeping like a daily dev journal. So every time I read an article, if there's anything interesting there, I drop the link in the current date. I add some notes, and it's been so many times that I wanted to go back and look up the information, and I found it useful. I found it super useful because you just forget, you don't remember details, or you want to share it, or you just don't recall exactly where you found it. So that was really good. and it just adds up. It's like a second brain,
Yeah,
which is
that's the real.
which it is. Yeah, second brain technique.
Yeah, got it. Nice. Priyanka, by the way, like once you're done, like you can actually pick the next person. So that's how it usually goes. But yeah, you can go.
Priyanka, you can go.
Okay. So this is not, I think, very interesting to you guys, but recently I learned that Vim is a very good tool for coding. So I think Dinesh is laughing there. Yeah. So I used to have very, very bad perspective about Vim. But recently I learned that it can be a very good ID for your code editing. So yeah, I think that'll help if you have good research on it and have good command over your keys. Yes.
Yeah, it's because like we had the discussion, like I'm a huge Vim fan, like I dropped all the editors. So for me, everything is Vim. Like even my command line is a Vim binding. So that's the context. Yeah, pick the next person, Priyanka.
Akanksha, would you like to go now?
Honestly, I miss the days when I had these open source tools because I like, again, I work at a large corporation, so I'm not allowed to use a lot of things. Like one of the things that I always use was like Postman collection, sharing those. And when I joined my current team, I was actually told that I will not be allowed to use it anymore because it would expose our internal APIs to like Postman might be collecting data on what you're working on. So I miss the days when I used to like I really don't use anything out of my organization right now.
But I'm sure like would Microsoft would be building so many tools internally to sort of like tackle the similar things, right? So
Yeah.
but yeah, like for I don't know whether it's dev friendly, but sure, like if you have anything still like for a
I
use
mean,
case, you can share.
a few
Yeah.
things, obviously, like a lot of things I use, which is licensed, like JetBrains based IDs, like Sublime text editor, things like that, obviously. But mostly it's like definitely does improve your productivity, but most of the tools are internal. Like even for like the formatting libraries or something like simple, which which finds like warnings or bugs in your code, something like code quality monitor, even those are internal. So I honestly don't have anything off the top of my mind. Before I worked here, definitely Postman was one of those things, like all the things it provided when you have to collaborate with someone.
I really like Postman too.
Yeah.
Cool. So pick a person.
Sorry, I think I'm not sure how for Dilu. I don't know how to pronounce your name, sorry.
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, you yeah, you got it right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, everyone. I mean, it's my first time here, and I apologize I joined late, but it's been really insightful. I haven't really done much microservice, but with the conversation going on, I was able to like retrospect on a lot of things. So regarding the discussion, for me, I don't like usually try out new tools, but in the company where I work, they recently did a subscription with the Google GitHub Copilot. So and I've really found it useful. I use it to generate doc string and documentation based on the code and comments sometimes. So it's been really good. So I mean that would be like the most recent tool that I've tried. I had a wow moment. Yeah.
Nice. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, like
Yeah.
all of the groups I go to, like it goes into a larger AI discussion. Like it's good that like we went to Microsoft's discussion because of Drew. So yeah. Ranjit, Adalis, yeah.
Yeah, next person can be Adelis. That's right. If not, Ranjit.
Yeah, so I'm joining for first time today, so along with Fodilo, right? So I joined late, sorry, but I think there was some interesting discussion there. So the first I'll go with the tool. So I think recently, maybe like 3 months back, I installed a tool called Logseek. I hope you guys heard about it. It's an documentation tool. Basically, it uses like a tree data structure. Like for example, compared to OneNote, basically it can easily link to other pages and finds the related pages for documentation. So still exploring, and there are like some other additional features as well. I did not explore all the features yet, but I think it's really a good tool with a good concept. So yeah, I'm liking that tool. It's kind of helpful for me to maintain my daily notes and other important notes, right? So yeah, that's one thing. Another question I wanted to ask, like, what is the agenda of these meetings? Like, this is the first time I'm joining. I don't know exactly. So, and how frequently are these meetings?
I can share that outline maybe
Okay,
at the end.
okay,
Uh,
sure. No problem. Yeah, no problem.
I think, yeah, nice to see you, Michael, finally. So, I can share mine. Like I used to be in a place where like so much of productivity was a thing, but like that time I learned a lot of tools. Even like caps lock is my escape. That's how I use Vim. But Hammerspoon and Carabiner, I loved it because like if you have, let's say, 10 applications, I can give a key combination like Shift B, and then I quickly jump to Brave. And then if I press another key combination, I can jump to like Alacrity. Yeah, I use Alacrity, not like iTurn 2 or anything. Like there are a lot of tools like which I've used in that sense. But as I mentioned, like SOPs is something like really good. Like anyone who's, if you're working within your own uh, organization, keeping secrets in a plain text, you should keep it in encrypted format. And then I personally like let's say Age. I think like he has built so much tools like MKCert, Philo. Like he has built like MKCert, Age, encryption mechanism, and so many other things. So like you can, it sort of leverages that. Like so the whole ecosystem around encryption, he contributes a lot. So this is something like I found it really good. Like because certificate management is super painful otherwise. But yeah, like I have a lot of tools in that sense. Probably I'll share it over time. I think everybody shared. Like so, I'll quickly share the context on the agenda, right? Like I think like it's in Luma as well. The objective is to meet every month. Like we'll do a monthly call. Like we can do bi-weekly if everyone is up for it, but ideally we'll do monthly call. We're not doing like live meet because like a lot of people have concerns with it. Like maybe we'll try to plan once in a quarter to meet live, or even otherwise, like apart from the meetup, we can plan to meet over a coffee. The agenda is basically like there is no agenda. That's the interesting part about the structure, because usually when you go to a meetup, there is one topic, and then usually there is no question and answers. Like I've always seen people are passive. So here the structure is you bring topics which you want to be discussed or which you want other experts or like other people to give opinion on. And then we come to a Trello board and then we list the topics. We voted because like when there's a larger group, when you have so many questions, that time voting helps. And then like we pick the right topics and then we start discussing. And then usually like everyone shares about their personal experience with that, right? Like just like how you did for tooling, everyone shared their opinions. So that's how it's usually structures. If you want to discuss more topics, we can do a time constraint and all of that. But yeah, that's the idea. But what we're going to discuss is more about like I'm personally passionate about distributed systems. I've done a lot of Go, Kafka, and all of that. So like a bunch of things I can share. Whatever other people's expertise is, like we can bring in that and also discuss around it. if you want to have like a dedicated talk, if somebody wants to give a talk, like we can host that in between as well. Because I'll give you context, right? Like I used to host Kafka community a while back. Like I started in Vancouver also, but it's such a niche that like there's not big communities. So this community, I hope like it's for a lot of people's interest. We can grow the community over time. Maybe we can talk through Discord or like keep each other's in loop with other things as well. But yeah, that's the agenda. Like I don't know whether that answered your question. If there is any questions, yeah, feel free to shoot. Like even if not, yeah.
Sure, thanks. So like, do we have access to that board which you are talking about?
Yes, we do. So I have shared the same thing in the Luma event, but like I'll keep sharing it. Like we'll update it. We'll keep using it for further events as well. I'll keep everyone posted.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you.
But yeah, like if not, thanks everyone for joining. Like I'll just stop the recording, and then if there is anything else, like we can discuss. But like otherwise, we're on time. Like it was nice hearing from everyone's input. Definitely, like Microsoft has kept us occupied for a good time. So it's actually a nice thing too. Like next time, I hope like more people are gonna bring more topics. But yeah, thanks for joining.